Welcome to the Freak Show, fellow freaks.
I am Matthew Brockmeyer.
And I'm Christa Carmen.
And this is
Murder Coaster.
Ladies and gentlemen, today we present to you the story of a little girl who outwitted a serial killer and apex child predator. The harrowing tale of Shasta Groene and Joseph Edward Duncan. It is a story of survival in the face of unimaginable horrors and resilience and healing in the aftermath of unspeakable trauma. We used a plethora of sources for today's show: the book Stolen in the Night by Gary King, interviews, newspaper articles, blogs from the criminal himself. But our main source was the book Out of the Woods by Gregg Olsen, which he wrote with Shasta herself, telling not only the story of her abduction, but the aftermath as well. It is one of the most horrifying and gut-wrenching books I have ever read. It truly disturbed me to my core and tore at my soul. But like all great true crime, when I made it to the other side, I feel it made me a better person. More human, empathetic, kinder, and despite the darkness, it gave me hope. For this is not the story of a victim. It is the story of a survivor named Shasta Groene, and the monster who stalked her. Listener discretion is advised.
Let's begin. Prologue. Wolf Lodge Bay, Idaho. Monday, May 16th, 2005, began as a weird day for farmer Robert Hollingsworth. When he got up that morning and went to feed his chickens, he discovered an abandoned white pickup truck parked by his barn, with what looked like might be blood on the driver's door. There was no sign of who could have left the vehicle there. It was strange and eerie because it was down a long dirt driveway far off the beaten path, and Wolf Lodge Bay itself, situated in eastern Coeur d'Alene, was a remote and rural part of northern Idaho, nestled in the mountains between Washington State and Montana, with Canada to the north. So he reported the vehicle to the police and went about his day.
Late that afternoon, as evening approached, Robert realized he hadn't paid his neighbor, 13-year-old Slade Groene, the $10 he owed him for mowing his lawn. Slade's family often struggled financially, and Robert felt a pang of guilt. So he hopped in his truck and drove over, down Frontage Road, following Wolf Lodge Creek, the creek which eventually spills into the bay, and Lake Coeur d'Alene.
When he pulls up to the squat white house, which sat in the hills right where the land rose up into the mountains, the family vehicles were parked in the normal spots. But the house was strangely quiet and dark, though he could hear a dog barking inside.
He gave his horn a friendly tap-tap, as was his custom. Normally, the kids would come bounding out to investigate, but nothing stirred. So he lumbered out and approached the small covered porch and immediately saw blood. Blood everywhere, on the doorway, on the steps. Large pools and puddles of the crimson stuff. So he ran back to his truck, beelined it home, and for the second time that day, called the police.
A team of deputies from the Kootenai County Sheriff's Department arrived at the house on 12725 Frontage Road at 6:15, just as the sun was beginning to set. They saw all the blood and knocked on the door. No answer. So they walked around the house, peering into the windows, calling out, "Hello? Anybody home?"
The door on the east side of the house was unlocked, and fearing someone might be injured inside, they decided to enter and were stunned at the carnage that lay before them.
Between the kitchen and the living room, two bodies lay face down on the floor in massive pools of blood, both bound with duct tape and zip ties, arms cinched behind their backs. One was an adult woman, the other an adolescent boy. Their heads were severely traumatized by what appeared to be gunshot wounds.
In the living room was a third victim, a balding male with a beard, also face down and bound with zip ties and duct tape. There was blood everywhere, splattered on the walls, ceiling, as well as bloody footprints, handprints, and signs of a struggle. A glass coffee table shattered, shards splayed across the floor.
They were able to identify the bodies as Brenda K. Groene, 40, her boyfriend Mark McKenzie, 37, and Brenda's son Slade, 13. Eventually, it would be determined that the victims hadn't died of gunshot wounds as first suspected, but by having their heads struck repeatedly with a hammer.
Distressingly, there were two other children who lived in the house, 8-year-old Shasta Groene and her 9-year-old brother Dylan, but there was no sign of them.
Volunteers with the Kootenai County Search and Rescue Council, hoping the children had managed to run off during the carnage, fanned out in all directions, through the forest and mountains that surrounded the home, on foot, on horseback, in all-terrain vehicles, some using tracking dogs, as well as corpse-sniffing dogs.
A helicopter was called in, and Idaho State Police and eventually the FBI also joined the search for the missing children. A nationwide Amber Alert was issued for Dylan, 4 foot, 60 pounds, with blue eyes and a blonde crew cut, and Shasta, 3 foot 10 inches, 40 pounds, hazel eyes and long brown hair.
The biggest manhunt in Kootenai County commenced. All to no avail. There wasn't a trace of the siblings.
Flyers were pasted up in gas stations and post offices for thousands of miles. Huge billboards with the heartbreakingly cute faces of Shasta and Dylan adorned the highways. Cable news networks went crazy, reporting on the adorable missing children. Still nothing.
Then, 47 days later, at 1:45 in the morning, right there in Coeur d'Alene, a man and a young girl walked into a Denny's restaurant and took a seat in the back corner booth.
Immediately, there were whispers that the girl looked like missing Shasta Groene. First from a couple customers sitting outside the restaurant, who alerted the waitress and manager, who then called the police.
After police showed up and led the man away, the little girl identified herself as Shasta Groene and told an extraordinarily harrowing and disturbing tale of sexual abuse and torture, much of it filmed by the man, one Joseph Duncan, a convicted pedophile and rapist on the run, with multiple warrants and driving a stolen vehicle.
When asked where her brother was, she would say, "He's in heaven."
Bits of his skull would be found entangled in her hair.
The little girl would be able to tell police much more than just her own abuse at the hands of this monster who'd made her call him daddy. For he'd bragged to her of other crimes, murders, abductions, rapes, all of children, all unsolved.
And when police would try to discern how this little girl was able to survive, she told them, quote, "He told me I taught him how to love," end quote.
Chapter 1, Birth of a Monster.
There are many things we know about the monster, but many things are still a mystery.
We know Joseph Edward Duncan III was born on February 25th, 1963. But while most sources cite his place of birth as Fort Bragg, North Carolina, others state Tacoma, Washington, and prison records say New Orleans, Louisiana.
He was certainly named after his father, Joseph Edward Duncan Jr., but at some point, Joseph would begin to go by Jet, an acronym for his initials, Joseph Edward III. He has claimed his mother came up with the name to differentiate from his father, but he's also said a lover in prison came up with it and liked to call him Jazzy Jet.
One thing to remember is that Joseph Duncan was a compulsive liar, which many textbook psychopath narcissists are.
Jet was the fourth of 5 children born to Joseph Edward Duncan Jr. and Lillian May Duncan. He had 3 older sisters and a younger brother. Duncan's father was in the Army, a driver in the motor pool, and because of this, the family moved from city to city, country to country, changing locations every year or two.
Jet's mother, Lillian, was devoutly religious, going to church nearly every day, sometimes twice in a day, and was said to be a miserable and domineering woman, bitter about being an Army wife and constantly moving.
Jet's father, Joe, was weirdly square and awkwardly formal, with thick horn-rimmed glasses, and wore a black suit and tie at all times, even when he took the family to Disneyland.
When Jet was 12, his father retired from the Army, and they settled in Fort Lewis, right outside of Tacoma, Washington, where Joe became a postal worker.
Little Jet was his mother's unabashedly favorite child, and she doted on him and always came to his defense. Later, she'd claimed that he'd been molested as a young child when they were stationed in Germany, as well as by a church leader, and even by his father.
In 1979, Joe Sr. and Lillian separated, and according to Jet's siblings, Lillian became incredibly violent and abusive, making them stand in a corner for hours and often savagely beating them with a belt, then running off to her Pentecostal church to pray.
Susan, the oldest, says Lillian actually broke her shoulder. Sherry has scars on her face and body from her mother's beatings. And the youngest daughter, Tina, says her mother broke her arm. Tina also states that she believes Lillian was weirdly sexual with Jet, something that would be reiterated by psychologists and Jet himself.
But strange incestual events were common in the family. When Lillian left the children alone, they would engage in bizarre sex games, as Sherry later said.
The 5 of us, all together, nobody excluded. We did some things as an adult now that I'm not proud of. We used to pretend that we would capture somebody, and we would pretend like they were being held down. Then we would take their clothes off, and then punish them and stuff. It would always be like that when my mom went out, and me and my older sister were left in charge of everybody.
And Jet was often the victim in these games, as his siblings were resentful that he was the favorite. As he'd later say, "I've always felt unloved and unwanted by my sisters, even if I didn't understand why."
Jet says these games with his sisters were his first sexual memories, and that soon afterward he was molested by a neighbor who asked him to cut his grass, but instead photographed him naked and assaulted him. But Jet said he didn't mind the assault, didn't fight it, saying, quote,
"It's hard to explain, except to say that my experience with this man raised a lot of questions in me regarding my sexuality. They were questions that I only knew one way to answer: experimentation."
And signs of severe sociopathy began manifesting themselves early. When Jet was 15, he stole a car, got in a police chase, and crashed through a roadblock, shattering his sinuses and disfiguring him.
In a plea bargain, his charges were dropped down to second-degree assault, and he was sent to Jesse Dislin Boys Ranch in rural Pierce County, Washington.
But far from being a punishment, Joseph loved his stay at the ranch and would later say it was the happiest time of his life. He water skied, learned to play chess, and through a program got a job as a dishwasher at Madigan Army Medical Center.
Here he made his first attempt at abducting and molesting a child, targeting a 7-year-old, brandishing a knife, and dragging him into the bushes. But the child managed to escape, screaming for help, and Jet fled.
When Jet returned home from the ranch, all his siblings were gone, having fled their abusive mother the first chance they got. Now it was just Jet and his mother.
He returned to high school, now in the 10th grade, with a GPA of 1.7, and began compulsively taking drugs, smoking weed daily, experimenting with LSD, speed, Valium, even PCP, or angel dust.
He began actively molesting children. He raped a 5-year-old, then a 9-year-old at gunpoint, threatening a group of young kids in the woods with an axe, even molesting a baby his mother was in charge of babysitting. He later claimed that by the time he was 16, he'd sexually assaulted 13 boys.
Sadly, none of these crimes were reported to the police. At that time, in the late 70s, there was an element of shame to being victimized, especially for boys. It was something that just wasn't talked about and was ignored. It was thought it was better to just pretend it had never happened than to make a big scene.
In early 1980, Jet broke into a neighbor's house and stole several guns. Then on January 24th, later stating he was angry because his mother had gone out on a date, he abducted a 14-year-old boy named Ronnie Davidson at gunpoint and took him to the woods where he raped him multiple times, burning his buttocks with a cigarette.
Jet would later blog about this incident, saying, "At the time, I thought I was being nice to him, maybe even teaching him fun things. Even now, I can't imagine what sort of sheltered life he must have had if this was the worst thing that ever happened to him."
Ronnie went home and told his parents what happened. Horrified, they reported the incident to the police, who arrested Jet, and he began his long life of being incarcerated. The monster was 16 years old.
Chapter 2. Little ditty about Brenda and Stephen.
Wipe the sleep from your eyes. Quit your dreaming now, the sun is on the rise. And by the end of the day, this dusty room will be 1,000 miles away. Once heard it said in a song, best keep to traveling on.
Brenda K. Matthews was born March 31st, 1965, in rural Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and grew up playing in the creeks and mountains and swimming in Wolf Lodge Bay. She hated wearing shoes, something that would stick with her for her entire life, saying a person's feet on the earth strengthened their connection to the world, and by extension, to each other. She'd even mow the lawn barefoot.
She was petite and very, very pretty, with hazel eyes and dark hair. So skinny, her family nicknamed her Bones.
She loved making dream catchers out of yarn and sticks, a nod to the fact that she was part Native American.
She was an artist and free spirit, a painter and poet, wild as the wind, and she dropped out of high school and wandered down to the mountains of Southern California. By the time she met Steve Groene, she had already had one child named Vance.
Steve Groene was very much like Brenda. The two were a perfect match. He was a musician who loved motorcycles, who'd also dropped out of high school to follow his passions.
Brenda and Steve wed in 1986 in beautiful Big Bear Lake, California. She was 21, Steve was 29.
They started having children. First Jesse, then Slade, then Dylan, all boys. But Brenda yearned to have a little girl, and on November 25th, 1996, her wish came true when she gave birth to a beautiful baby girl she named Shasta.
Brenda was delighted with her baby girl, Shasta, but there were fissures forming in the family. Steve had put everything into his band, Blue Tattoo. He was constantly practicing and gigging, but his musical career just wasn't taking off, and they were cash-strapped.
There were constant money issues. They were hounded by bill collectors. The power would get turned off. They never knew where next month's rent was going to come from. Brenda ended up writing some bad checks, and they both liked to party a little too hard. She was arrested for DUI and drug paraphernalia.
They were fighting constantly, and it just became too much. And in 1999, Brenda took the kids and moved back to Idaho, to a house in Wolf Lodge that had been in her family for generations.
Some of Brenda's fondest memories were running barefoot through the woods of Coeur d'Alene with her brother and sisters, splashing in the creeks, swimming in the lake, hiking through the mountains. And now she wanted her children, including little Shasta, who was only 3 years old, to do the same.
Chapter 3: The Life of a Monster.
In 1980, 16-year-old Joseph Edward Duncan III was convicted of raping and torturing Ronnie Davidson at gunpoint and sentenced to 20 years. But since he was a juvenile and seemingly amenable to treatment, he was sent to the Western State Hospital.
Western State Hospital had been established way back in 1871 as the insane asylum of the Washington Territory, and it had always been a place of experimentation. Electroshock therapy, hydrotherapy, insulin therapy, frontal lobotomies, all in an effort to cure what were then called the criminally insane. Now they had a new experimental program called the Sexual Psychopath Treatment Program, which used a combination of psychotropic drugs, behavior modification, and group therapy.
Jet was the very first juvenile to ever be in the Sexual Psychopath Treatment Program. He was put in a group of 19 adult rapists and sexual sadists, whom he said taught him more about sexual deviancy than he could ever dream of. Instead of being cured of his horrible desires, he was able to refine them.
Pretty much exactly what happened to Edmund Kemper when he was put in a Tuscadero after killing his grandparents. Jet says he was happy at the Western State Hospital, especially as he had friends who he could tell his fantasies to. But after 3 years in the program, he broke.
Relatives were allowed to visit the hospital and stay on the grounds in little trailers with inmates. When Jet's father came, and he stayed in the trailer with him, Jet masturbated to images of children he cut out of a clothing catalog. Then he snuck off, jumped the fence, and went to a construction site and masturbated in public, which, he said, thrilled him.
When his mother came to visit and they stayed in the little trailer, Jet says, quote, "I had an extremely emotional encounter with my mother that confused me. I realized that my mother had feelings for me, not quite motherly, that I couldn't understand, but have since come to understand were deeply related to the confusion that led me to think that forcing someone to have sex with me would help me find some resolution and understanding."
So he managed to get his hands on some gloves and an electrical cord, a rudimentary rape and torture kit, and snuck off the grounds, peeping into windows, where he watched a teenage girl in her bedroom. Thankfully, a man spotted him and chased him with some dogs. So he ran back to the asylum, woke his mother, and asked her to teach him how to disco dance.
Yes, sexually charged. He asked his mother to teach him how to disco dance, and they spent the night gyrating to the Bee Gees. So fucking weird, man. I wonder what Freud would have said about that.
Probably a lot. Jet then confided all this during a group therapy session,
Which led a program supervisor to state, quote, Mr. Duncan knew this type of deviant behavior and escape is not condoned by the sex offender program. Therefore, we feel he is not amenable to treatment.
So Jet was then sent to the Washington State Department of Corrections to serve the rest of his time, but was released on parole in 1994 after serving 14 years of his 20-year sentence.
Now a free man at last, Jet traveled about, making friends, like pediatrician Richard Waxman, whom he met in a gay bar in San Francisco.
The thing about the monster is he didn't look like a monster. He had grown tall in prison, 6'2", but he was lanky, skinny, only weighing 150 pounds, and had a very plain face that appeared very non-threatening, kind even. A mask that hid his true, repulsive, and horrible nature. He learned how to manipulate people and lie to make friends, and appear utterly harmless, though he was incredibly dangerous and an absolute sociopath.
He lived in Seattle for a while and was arrested there in 1996 for smoking weed, but was released after only a few weeks.
On July 6, 1996, near midnight, he was driving through Seattle when he came across two little girls walking down the road, so he pulled over and motioned them to his car, asking them if they'd seen his cat, then coaxed them into his car to help him look.
The girls, Sammy Jo, 11, and Carmen, 9, were from a very poor family, living in a motel room nearby, desperate for money. They'd often panhandle on the streets, and when Jet offered them a few dollars, they eagerly jumped into his car.
After sexually assaulting and strangling them, he dismembered their bodies and hid the remains in an abandoned barn. It would be nearly 2 years before they were located, when a transient discovered one of their skulls. Jet was never even suspected of the crime.
Working as a phone solicitor for Time Life Libraries in Seattle, Jet made friends with an older African-American woman named Dee, and the two became lovers, though he claimed she was more of a mother figure to him. On April 1st, 1997, Jet stole Dee's car, a Chrysler New Yorker, and drove down the coast, all the way to Southern California, hunting for children to abduct.
On April 4th, 1997, Jet was roaming the streets and alleys of Riverside when he encountered a group of children in an alley behind an apartment complex.
This guy is the literal boogeyman. He pulled up and told them he was looking for his cat, offered them $1 if they'd help him look. Then he pulled a knife and grabbed the littlest one. But the littlest brother, Anthony, stepped between them, and Jet grabbed Anthony instead. And as the other children scattered and ran, Jet struck Anthony on the back of the head, tossed him into his car, driving him out to the desert south of Joshua Tree National Park, where he tortured and sexually assaulted him.
Anthony told Jet he loved Jesus and would go to heaven. Jet then bound him in duct tape and murdered him by crushing his head with a rock.
Jet went to a shopping center and shaved the beard he'd been growing and threw away the baseball cap he'd been wearing, then drove back to Washington and dropped the car off at the Spokane Greyhound station, where he told Dee she could pick it up. She never saw him again.
Anthony's body was found by a park ranger several weeks later. The case would go unsolved for nearly a decade.
Back in Seattle, Jet failed a drug test and went on the run. An arrest warrant was soon issued for breaking parole, but Jet was nowhere to be found, and the FBI was soon on the hunt for him.
Jet was tracked to Kansas City, Missouri, and arrested there by the FBI.
His friend, Dr. Waxman, hired a lawyer for him and wrote letters and testified on Jet's behalf, saying he was a changed man. Even saying he could move in with his family, including his 2 children, aged 8 and 11. But the parole board, very wisely, thought that was a very, very bad idea. And Jet was sent back to Washington State Department of Corrections.
Here it was noted by prison authorities that he bullied other prisoners for sex and was completely unrepentant. One psychologist stating, quote,
"Concerns about his ability to refrain from sexually violent behavior remain. He is a skilled liar and an untreated sex offender with a long-standing history of sexually deviant behavior and sexual excitement he associates with aggression and violence."
But his friend, Dr. Waxman, continued to plead on his behalf and had lawyers working on the case. Despite the reports from prison psychologists, he was released from prison on July 14th, 2000, credited with juvenile time already served, and moved to Fargo, North Dakota, where his friend, Dr. Waxman, was living.
The monster was required to register as a sex offender, but he did not do that.
Dr. Waxman rented him an apartment and enrolled him in computer classes at North Dakota State University. Jet did very well. He had a knack for computers. He started blogging and posting videos on the internet. He became friends with a local businessman named Joe Crary.
2004, the monster drove out to Detroit Lakes, Minnesota, and molested 2 boys he found on a playground, one 6, one 8, and he was arrested for the offense. And he'd later say, it was no big deal. He hadn't even had sex with them, just pulled down their pants and played with their genitals. And he hadn't even filmed it.
I'm so glad that... Never mind. Spoiler alert. You can cut this. I was going to say I'm glad this fucker's dead. On April 5th, 2005, he appeared before a judge who set bail at $15,000. And his friends Joe Crary and Dr. Richard Waxman posted bail for him.
The monster then skipped bail and disappeared. On June 1st, a federal warrant was issued for Duncan's arrest for the unlawful flight to avoid prosecution. But the monster was long, long gone.
Chapter 4. The House by the Lake.
When Brenda took the kids and moved into the house in Wolf Lodge, there on Frontage Road, set back from Interstate 90, in a secluded spot where the hills rose up into the mountains, Steve was not happy.
They had a shared custody agreement, and he said it was too difficult for him to get there regularly. But he lived as close as he could, and they did their best to make it work, though it could be acrimonious at times. Eventually, the oldest boys, Vance and Jesse, moved in with Steve, leaving Slade, Dylan, and Shasta with Brenda.
The house was a bit of a shambles and needed a lot of work, But Brenda made it home. She painted a beautiful mandala on the ceiling and flowers along the walls, dancing barefoot to Sheryl Crow and Kid Rock, her favorite bands. She made do the best she could, sewing the kids their clothes, and when she had to, stretching plastic over broken windows, filling the house with mismatched thrift store furniture and dream weavers.
She worked as a waitress at Chinese Gardens for a while, then ran a maid and cleaning service. Brenda washed their clothes in the sink and hung them to dry in the kitchen. There were always piles of dirty laundry, as the kids loved to play in the dirt and mud. They had 2 rescue dogs, which Shasta and Dylan adored, Sarah and Crush.
Then Brenda hooked up with one of Steve's old buddies, Mark McKenzie. Mark was an outdoorsman, a hunter, who wore flannel shirts and work pants. He had red hair and a goatee. Though he liked to party hard, he was reliable. He had a good steady job in a stainless steel manufacturing plant.
Most importantly, the kids loved him. He'd take them fishing, berry picking, hunting, camping.
But Brenda and Mark were wild. They really liked to party, and they hung out with a wild bunch. On the weekends, Brenda and Mark would have big parties, barbecues that would last the entire weekend, often fueled at night by methamphetamine and cocaine. Most of the light bulbs ended up missing, having been used as speed pipes.
When the toilet and shower stopped working, the septic tank all backed up, they set up a makeshift bathroom in the backyard and put an old clawfoot bathtub by the creek. When it was time to give Dylan or Shasta a bath, Brenda would haul hot water out to the old tub, then light candles or set out battery-powered lights, which was absolutely magical to the kids. The glimmer of the candles like dragonflies, bathing beneath the stars to a chorus of bullfrogs.
And just like Brenda had done as a little girl, Shasta and Dylan ran free in the woods, little nature children. They hunted for crawdads in the sunlight and at night used a flashlight.
There was a large crabapple tree in the front yard with a swing on it. In the spring, a blizzard of tiny blossoms would rain down. In the summer, they'd have bonfires beneath it, and in the autumn, they'd have epic crabapple fights.
Shasta would later say,
"The crabapple tree stood guard over us. It saw everything."
Slade had his own room. Dylan and Shasta shared a room. Shasta's bedding was pink and Dylan's blue. He had video games, toy cars, and a soccer ball. She had Barbie dolls and stuffed animals.
Dylan and Shasta were a team, always running around the property on their bikes, playing in the woods. The forest was like another room in the cabin, and when other kids at school teased them for being poor, they stuck up for each other. They always had each other, an inseparable bond.
Dylan was the sweet one, the kind one, always ready with a smile and a hug, eager to help, and Brenda called him Dilly Pickle. And because Shasta was the only girl, she was the princess.
Slade, on the other hand, was the problem child.
Slade wanted to be a musician like his father. He had a drum kit and a guitar. Then he started rapping, singing about how tough and mean he was, a persona which led him to become deeply troubled and problematic at just 13 years old.
He was a bully and got into fights. He beat up kids for no reason at all, abused the family pets, attempted to poison their drinking water, slitting Shasta's kitten's neck.
Then he stole cocaine from Brenda and brought it to school, got caught, and was expelled.
After Slade was caught with the cocaine, Child Protective Services came to the house, and Brenda went into a whirlwind, cleaning and scrubbing with only hours before they arrived. She went into the non-functioning bathroom where the septic was backing up into the shower drain and somehow cleaned it spotless, erasing the horrible odor, making it appear that it worked fine.
Most disturbingly, Slade was abusing little Shasta, abusing her sexually, touching her, forcing her to do things to him.
Brenda, with her motherly instincts, picked up that something was wrong, seemed to know somehow, and sat Shasta down, asking her if anyone had been touching her in a bad way, a wrong way. But Shasta was scared to tell the truth and just told her no.
And then one day, Brenda called out to Steve, saying,
"There's a man up there in the mountains watching us. With binoculars, I saw him."
But when Steve looked, whoever it was watching them in the woods had vanished.
Chapter 5. A Monster in Wolf Lodge.
Silver sun, tell me what you've done. Silver sun, all the lies that you have spun. Are you sure that I would rather be forever
After skipping bail in Minnesota, the monster rented a red Jeep Grand Cherokee on April 15th, 2005, which he never returned, the vehicle being reported stolen on May 4th. He went back to Fargo, North Dakota, borrowed money from his friends, then went to a Walmart and purchased night vision goggles, a shotgun, a Fat Max framing hammer, duct tape, a knife, food, binoculars, waterproof tarps, and a video camcorder.
He drove to Missouri and stole a set of license plates which he affixed to the stolen Jeep, then drove north to Interstate 90 and headed west, through Wyoming and Montana and into Idaho. At the same time, arrest warrants were being prepared for him in Minnesota and North Dakota.
During the second week of May, he trolled through Idaho, along Lake Coeur d'Alene, exiting off Interstate 90 and onto Frontage Road and into Wolf Lodge Bay.
Why the monster chose Idaho, why Wolf Lodge Bay, is anyone's guess. He was a literal predator, roaming the basins, deserts, and mountains of the American Northwest, searching for the most vulnerable prey. A beast horrible and hungry.
Driving along Frontage Road and into Wolf Lodge, he spied a small white house at the base of a mountain, secluded and nearly hidden within a grove of tall pines.
He'd later say he was attracted to the house when he saw Shasta and her mother sunbathing, and later again say that it was when he saw Shasta and Dylan playing with a garden hose in their bathing suits. Who knows, the monster was a liar, but Shasta and Dylan did sometimes go out to the road and motion for passing truckers to honk their air horns. Either way, the monster had found his prey.
The monster watched the house for days, perched in the mountains above, studying the movements of the people within and their neighbors with binoculars, once even being noticed by the mother.
At night, he'd spy on them with his night vision goggles and creep down out of the woods to peer through their windows, greeting the dogs, letting them get to know him, giving them food.
Then on May 15th, 2005, he parked his Jeep on the neighbor's property up by the barn, slipped on a ski mask and gloves, took his hammer and a sawed-off shotgun, and crept through the night, down Wolf Creek, and to the back of the house, turned the knob on the door. It was unlocked, which he says he took as a sign from God, giving him permission to do what he was about to do.
Chapter 6, May 15th, 2005.
We held on tight, but it felt so long. Tell me, where did we go wrong? When you're in the sun and I'm lost in the shade, then who's supposed to lead the way? The home that you built, sweetness in my veins, we could survive on what remains. You were the one, we had nothing to fear. What we had should still be there. The fire we have and the flaws, I just hope that you want it all.
Shasta would later say she remembered hearing the dogs barking, but they always barked. The forest was filled with raccoons, possums, foxes. Then the dogs quieted. At one point, she thought she saw a man's face in her bedroom closet and called out for Dylan, who crept into bed with her. Then her mother appeared before her, whispering to her,
Someone's here, and he wants us to get out of the house. We need to go now.
Eight-year-old Shasta and 9-year-old Dylan followed their mother through the darkness into the living room, where a man in a ski mask and all-black tactical gear stood holding a shotgun over Mark and Slade, who lay face down on the ground in their underwear, arms pinned behind their backs with zip ties.
At first, Shasta thought he might be a police officer. As the man grabbed her mother and began looping zip ties around her wrists and ankles, she told Shasta, "We need to do everything he says."
The man then put Brenda down on the floor and began putting zip ties on Shasta and Dylan, though he kept their ankles free, saying through the black ski mask, "It's gonna be all right. Everything will be just fine."
The man demanded drugs and money from Mark, who said he didn't have any, telling him to check his wallet, which he did, but it was completely empty. Mark told him to take his truck, and the man said,
"I don't want your fucking truck. I want the money."
"We don't have any fucking money," Mark screamed.
"Don't yell at me, or I'll kill you."
Brenda was squirming, saying the zip ties were too tight. The man went over, took a hammer, and inserted the claw end into her bindings and hauled her up off the floor. But she lost her balance and slammed down onto the glass coffee table, shattering it, glass going everywhere.
"Here," the man said, reaching down, "let me help you." And he swung the hammer, hitting Brenda in the head with a horrible thunk.
Brenda began to convulse and gurgle, and Mark fought his binds, trying to stand, screaming, "Brenda! Brenda! Are you all right?"
Brenda just gurgled as the man struck her again and again, later saying, quote, "I struck her in the head several times, each time from a different angle and in a different location on the skull to inflict as much damage to the brain as quickly and mercifully as possible."
The man then lifted little Shasta up and carried her outside, set her down by the old crabapple tree, then disappeared and returned a moment later with Dylan, placing him beside her, saying,
"Make a sound, and I'll kill your family."
All was quiet and still. She could hear the rush of cars on the freeway far in the distance.
Then Slade burst out the door, covered in blood, trying to run with his hands behind his back, followed by the man in the black ski mask carrying a rifle, walking quickly up behind Slade and hitting him in the back of the head with the butt of the gun.
Then Slade fell over and the man dragged him back into the house.
Then the man was putting Shasta and Dylan in the back of their Uncle Dan's white pickup truck that had been parked behind the house, Mark fixing it for him.
He drove them down the driveway of a neighbor who used to pay Slade to mow his lawn, parking by the neighbor's shed, then loaded them into a red Jeep Cherokee, putting Shasta on the front passenger floorboard and Dylan in the back seat.
With her cheek pressed on the floor, Shasta could feel the road change from the bumps of the driveway to the smooth hum of the highway, and knew they were now on Interstate 90.
She looked up at the man who'd taken his ski mask off. He looked very normal. Blue eyes and wavy brown hair. He asked her if she'd ever given oral sex. She said no, and he hit her, and said he knew she had, and unzipped his pants and forced her on him.
How had he known that, Shasta wondered? Had he somehow seen Slade do that to her?
They drove and drove through the night. At one point, Shasta saw a sign for the Lolo National Forest and realized they were in Montana.
He told them, "I'm taking you to a place where nobody can find us. It's a place where if you run away, you'll die. A place where no one can hear you call out for help."
Chapter 7. The first of 45 days in the Lolo National Forest.
The road up the mountain was thin and so narrow that the man had to roll down the window and look down to make sure he didn't drive off the edge.
The bumpy dirt road curved round and round, up and up and up, until they were at the top, where they stopped and the man dragged a log across the road.
They pulled into a clearing, and the man, who told them to call him Daddy, led them to a grove of fir trees. When he produced a long chain, they began to cry and whimper, and he told them not to worry. He was just locking them up so they couldn't run away. He looped the chain around their ankles and locked it, then locked the other ends to a tree, the chains just long enough so that they could reach each other, but couldn't touch.
The man then went about setting up camp, pitching a large green domed tent, blowing up an air mattress, setting out a green tote with kitchen utensils, nailing a solar shower up into a tree. He seemed to know exactly what he was doing. Everything planned out and methodical.
When they cried, he made fun of them. Boo-hoo! The kids want to go home.
He focused his wrath on Dylan, calling him horrible names, shoving him to the ground, saying,
You're such a fucking little coward.
He then unlocked them from their shackles and took them into the tent, and told them, Your mom, your brother, and stepdad are all fine.
When Dylan asked, Really? He growled, I told you everyone is fine. You guys better fucking listen to me.
He then opened a Bible and started reading them passages.
Jet told the children God had instructed him to do this. He said that if he didn't do it, the secret government would kill him, and that it was all part of God's plan.
He told them he'd done all he could to fight off the demons, that none of this was his fault. He then locked his cold blue eyes on them and said,
I'm here to do the devil's work.
He set up a video camera in the tent, then held out his hands and said,
God, what should I do with these children? What would you have me do with these children, dear God? Thy will be done.
As the video camera hummed, filming it all, Jet then demanded they perform fellatio on him, the whole time carrying on a conversation with God. He then had them perform sex acts on each other before raping each of them, telling them to call him Jazzy Jeff as they bled onto the floor of the tent.
Chapter 8. The Devil's Work.
It was so cold the first night in the forest that they slept in the Jeep, Jet folding down the back seats and putting the air mattress there for Shasta and Dylan while he slept in the front seat, where he'd turn the heater off and on throughout the night.
Shasta could see her brother was in a lot of pain and terrified, even more scared than her. So as Jet snored in the front seat, she promised Dylan they'd make it out alive, that she'd do everything she could to ensure it, reaching out her hand and hooking her pinky with his, making a pinky promise that they'd get home together, a promise she'd never forget and that would always haunt her.
The days were a bizarre mix of mundane camping chores and horrible abuse. Sometimes Jet would go to town and chain them up. One day they played dress-up, Jet filming it all, giving Dylan a detective badge and purple plastic gun, and Shasta a cowgirl outfit and fake pearl choker Jet had brought back from town, giving her makeup to put on, which got Jet very excited. She decided she'd do whatever it took to make him happy, saying, "Thank you, Daddy."
Jet laughed, gave Dylan a cigarette to smoke, cajoling Shasta into taking off her clothes, saying he'd pay her $1 million, saying dance for daddy, as she stripped, then throwing dollar bills at her.
Shasta went along with all of it, but Dylan would often just stand there and stare, so deeply traumatized he couldn't function, and Shasta would do whatever she could to protect him, make that solemn pinky promise come true, offering herself to Jet so he'd leave her brother alone.
Jet would fiddle with his laptop, telling them he was going to put the videos on his blog, saying he had lots of videos of children he shared with his friends, and said he and his doctor friend loved filming each other, putting their fists in each other's rectums, which made no sense to Shasta whatsoever. Why would they do that?
They'd sit around the campfire at night eating Chef Boyardee ravioli and Del Monte fruit salad from the can, Jet giving them beers to wash it down with, sometimes giving them whiskey and cigarettes as well, and Jet would regale them with stories of his deviancy, saying,
"I've done other kids." He told them about how he'd found Sammy Joe and Carmen walking down Aurora Avenue in Seattle, telling them strange details, how poor they were, how they were out in the middle of the night asking for spare change to buy their brother a pack of cigarettes, how he'd strangled them after violating them in every way he knew how, and how no one had suspected him at all, how he'd cleverly hidden their body parts after he'd butchered them, acting it all out, telling Shasta and Dylan how he'd abducted little Anthony in Riverside and stoned him to death, calling Anthony his prize.
Jet told them he was on a mission to teach society a lesson. He told them that God commanded he do what he do so much that Shasta began to wonder why God hated her so badly.
He bragged about all his friends, people who he said were just like him, that were rich and powerful. A businessman in Fargo named Joe Crary, and a doctor named Richard Waxman.
Coaxing herself to sleep at night, Shasta would think of her Barbie dolls and her backpack of school books hanging on her door with a tooth in it she'd forgotten to put under her pillow for the tooth fairy.
Jet's moods and emotions would swing wildly. 1 minute happy and chipper, regaling them with stories of his youth, bragging about how smart he was, how he had gotten a college education. The next dark and dour, ranting about the devil and the wages of sin.
Little Shasta and Dylan would try to go along with his moods, encourage him when he was happy, stay silent when darkness set upon him. But it was difficult. Dylan asked him a question, nothing really, something silly, and suddenly Jet's face turned bright red, the veins in his neck engorged and throbbing.
"What the fuck did you say to me, Dylan?" he demanded, then grabbed him, unchained him, and dragged him off into the tall pines and shadows, Shasta staring helplessly as they disappeared.
Then Jet came stomping back through the woods and unlocked Shasta, pulling her out into the stand of fir trees, where she saw with horror what she later described as the contraption.
It was a torture device made out of logs. Dylan was strapped naked, bent over one log, his wrists and ankles secured to metal bolts sunk into the wood.
Jet then stripped Shasta naked and chained her to a tree.
Dylan told him it hurt, the rough bark against his bared skin, and Jet shot back, "It hurts, Daddy."
Shasta began to cry, and Jet told her to shut the fuck up.
He then positioned the shotgun so it was aimed at Dylan's head, with a string attached to the trigger and looped over a branch, so that it hung before Jet. Jet telling Shasta that if she made any noise, a single whimper, he'd pull the trigger and kill her brother. That she was to watch, and that if she closed her eyes or looked away, he'd pull the string.
Jet beat Dylan with a switch, raped him, sodomized him with a branch, torturing him until his cries became the guttural noises of an injured animal, blood streaming down his legs.
When he was finished, Jet unchained them, brought them back to the campsite, and read to them from the Bible.
Chapter 9. The Burning. One night, Shasta woke up in the back of the Jeep, confused and disoriented. She didn't know where she was. First, she thought she was on a camping trip with her family. Her eyes were foggy and she could barely breathe. The windows were coated in condensation. She could see the campfire from the window, but it was in waves, all weird. She tried to wake her brother, but he wouldn't budge. Finally, she shook him until his eyes opened, and he told her he felt funny.
She tried to open the doors, but they were locked with the child's safety latches. So she climbed up and managed to open the driver's door a whoosh of fresh air coming in. Then Jet was there, telling them everything was going to be all right.
Later, she realized he'd rigged the exhaust to fill the car and tried to poison them. Jet telling her,
You were supposed to die that night. I didn't want it to be violent. I wanted you to both go peacefully in your sleep.
Jet then became incredibly nice, especially to Dylan, returning from town with gifts he'd picked up at the thrift store, like a Nerf gun. One night, he had them write their wishes on pieces of paper and throw them into the campfire. Dylan and Shasta, of course, wished to go home. Pestered to make more wishes, Shasta asked for a purse, makeup, and $1,000 million.
Jet laughed, telling them that he wished for forgiveness, saying, At least my wish is something I might get.
Jet wrote a letter to his mother while they were in the forest, telling her,
I have once again become a medium of violence in the world, and once again wish I was not alive. I know there is good and love in my heart, yet at the same time, there is a huge reservoir of hatred that drives me to hurt people. God has shown me the face of evil. Evil is real only because we make it real. I have been inflicted by an evil demon that is nurtured by our so-called criminal justice system.
He called himself the Chosen One.
Through it all, Shasta remained strong. In many ways, her life before being abducted had readied her. She was tough. She was a survivor. She was used to camping, bathing outside, not having an indoor toilet or shower, going to bed hungry at night, putting up with crazy, drunken adults, pretending everything was fine amidst chaos. She'd been molested by her brother. She'd survived it all. She would survive this, too.
Shasta did everything she could to make Jet like her. She told him she loved him, cared for him, and when Jet would direct his sexual abuse towards Dylan, she would say, No, do it to me, I like it. But secretly she'd fantasize about ways to kill him, stealing one of his knives and plunging it into his chest while he slept. When he passed her his bottle of whiskey, she'd pretend to drink from it, but spit in it instead.
Dylan, on the other hand, would eagerly gulp the whiskey, putting himself into a stupor.
When the song Behind Blue Eyes by The Who would come on the radio, Jet would turn it up and sing along, crooning,
No one knows what it's like to be the sad man, to be the bad man behind blue eyes.
Chapter 10, The Sixth Week.
Oh, how it goes in this stubborn town. No one seems to know how to get around. One said we say what we are and we do what we teach. Let me preach in my words. Oh, how it goes.
When Jet went off to town and left them chained to trees, Shasta would do anything to keep her brother from slipping into total horror, talking about how nice it would be to get back to elementary school and see their friends, to play soccer, telling him to think about their dogs.
Strangely enough, Shasta would later remember good times with her brother, swimming in the river, skipping rocks in the water, sitting around the campfire roasting marshmallows.
One day, Jet announced that he'd take one of them to town with him. He'd never offered this before. He said it didn't matter who, either or.
Dylan really wanted to go, and Shasta saw how happy the prospect made him, so she said she'd stay there in camp.
Anything to make Dylan happy.
Jet chained Shasta to a tree. Then he and Dylan, all smiles, drove off.
Shasta sat there and waited, the hours passing. But as the sun began to dip down below the horizon, she grew worried. What if they were in a wreck? Had driven off the cliff on that narrow road?
She began to scream for help. She screamed and screamed until her throat went raw and she lost her voice. She ran out of water. She hadn't eaten all day. It grew cold and a light rain began to fall as darkness descended.
All through the night she sat huddled. Dawn came and she waited and waited all day until again the sun dipped down and night fell over the forest. She lost track of time, was sure that she was going to die.
Then on the third day, the jeep came rumbling up the mountainside. Shasta was elated. She was going to live. She dragged her chain over to them, but for some reason, Dylan didn't get out. He sat in the jeep, a strange, broken look on his face.
Shasta opened the door, saying to her brother,
"I was so scared. I thought something happened to you."
but he didn't answer back, just sat there. She stared into his eyes. They were blank, empty.
What happened?
Jet said, he got hit by a car.
She noticed he had a dirty t-shirt wrapped around his neck, and when she touched it, he yelped.
She helped Dylan get into the back seat of the Jeep, and he immediately fell asleep.
Shasta went to Jet. "Is he going to be okay? He looks hurt."
Jet smiled. "He'll be okay. I promise." That night, Jet sat in the front seat of the Jeep watching a movie on his laptop, and Shasta crept over to see what it was. It was a naked man, whom she realized was Jet and Dylan. They were in some dilapidated cabin.
Dylan was suspended somehow from the ceiling by his neck, his hands tied behind his back, his legs kicking furiously.
Jet turned and looked at Shasta, smiling, and said, "Keep watching." And he turned up the volume so she could hear him reading Bible passages and ranting about God and Jesus and the devil as Dylan thrashed.
She watched as he beat Dylan with a loop of wire, and she began to cry and turn away, but Jet snapped at her.
"Keep watching. Daddy wants you to watch."
Jet was beating him and masturbating and reciting the Lord's Prayer, screaming,
"Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, thy will be done. Can this be your will? You put people on earth to do this? You let me do this? Where are you, God? Show yourself."
When Dylan stopped thrashing, Jet lowered him to the floor, performed CPR, bringing him back to life, telling him he'd been saved before hauling him back up by his neck again.
Jet laughed as Shasta moaned in horror at the video. And then Jet reached under the seat and pulled out the fat Max framing hammer, waving it in front of her face and saying, "See this? This is what I used to kill your family. And I'll use it to kill you and your brother, too."
Chapter 11. The Chipmunks.
After that night, Shasta made sure to keep Dylan close to her at all times. Her brother was catatonic, despondent, lost in despair and horror.
Jet seemed almost apologetic, like he was trying to make up for what he'd done. He took them swimming. They skipped rocks, went on hikes.
Slowly, Dylan began to come out of his stupor. He smiled again.
2 chipmunks would come into their camp looking for scraps of food. Dylan and Shasta named them Chipper and Chippy.
Jet told them with a smirk, "If you can catch one, I'll take you home and let you go."
Really? Dylan asked.
"I promise."
This newfound hope elated Dylan, and he constructed a trap, a cardboard box held up with a stick, and string tied around it, with ravioli as bait.
When the chipmunk went for the ravioli, he'd yank the string, but the chipmunk was always too fast for him, and soon grew weary of the trap.
Then Dylan tried to lure him into a potato chip bag, but that didn't work either. Then he'd leave an apple in a clear plastic tote, and as he and Shasta watched, the chubby little creature crawled in, and Dylan slapped the lid on it.
They had him! They'd done it! They were going home! They hugged and jumped up and down, joyous.
Shasta bounded up to Jet. Dylan did it! He caught Chippy!
Jet nodded. "I guess I have to keep my promise then. Let's pack up camp."
They all started packing, loading things up, taking down the tent and putting all the kitchen supplies in the tote. Dylan chugged down a beer happily. They were celebrating. Shasta took his hand in hers, so happy.
Then a crack rang out.
"What was that?" Shasta exclaimed, and turned to see her brother with a terrified look on his face, clenching his belly, trying to hold in his guts that were slipping through his fingers.
Then Jet was raising his sawed-off shotgun, and Shasta was pleading.
No, 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 don't do it, Jet, please, no!
And the gun went off. Chunks of Dylan's skull and brain and blood hitting Shasta in the side of the head and becoming entangled in her long brown hair as her brother fell to the ground, dead.
And it is here, ladies and gentlemen, that we have to leave you today. Please come back next week to hear how this incredibly brave little girl managed to survive the monster.
And feel free to reach out to us anytime about anything at all at murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com.
Bye-bye till next week.